Knowledge Products presents The Giants of Philosophy, Immanuel Kant, narrated by Charlton Heston. Part 8.
As moral agents, we're compelled to rise above our biases. We must stop giving self-serving justifications for the things we simply want to do, even though they might be wrong. The compulsion involved here is not, of course, a force of nature. Of course, we can act on our biases and give in to our unworthy desires. Most of us do that every day, at least in small ways. The compelling power of the moral law is more subtle. It speaks to our self-respect, our sense of our own dignity as human beings. When we ignore the dictates of conscience, of the moral law, we're diminished, made smaller as human beings. We become no better than animals. We're ashamed, even if we conceal these feelings from others, as Kant writes.
Man is not so completely an animal as to be indifferent to everything which reason says on its own, and to use it merely as a tool for satisfying his needs as a sensuous being.
The fact that we have a conscience reveals to us that we can live up to the dictates of universal moral law. The experiences of duty and conscience, guilt and shame, are crucial to Kant's moral thought. In these experiences, the abstract purity of moral law and the idea of the rational will become concrete and real for us. Yet for Kant, duty is no doubt the most important of all these experiences.
Duty is a practical, unconditional necessity of action. It must therefore hold for all rational beings. Whatever is derived from the particular natural situation of man as such, or from certain feelings and propensities, or even from a particular tendency of human reason which might not hold for the will of every rational being, can give a maxim valid for us, but not a law, not a duty.
Duty is closely related, then, to the moral law. Like moral law, it commands. Like moral law, its worth has nothing to do with our feelings.
The majesty of duty has nothing to do with the enjoyment of life. It has its own law, even its own tribunal. And however much one wishes to mix them together in order to offer the mixture to the sick, as though it were a medicine, they nevertheless soon separate.
Duty is relentless in its demands. Duty possesses its own inner standard of value, the same standard of value that marks the moral law in general.
In the greatest misfortunes of his life, which he could have avoided if he could have disregarded duty, does not a righteous man hold up his head, thanks to the consciousness that he has honored and preserved humanity in his own person and in its dignity, so that he does not have to shame himself in his own eye, or have reason to fear the scrutiny of self-examination. This comfort is not happiness, not even the smallest part of happiness. It is the effect of a respect for something entirely different from life, in comparison and contrast to which life and its enjoyment have absolutely no worth.
For Kant, duty is a hard master. He sums up his concept in a single sentence.
Duty is the necessity of an action executed from respect for law.
And he goes on to say,
that which does not serve my inclination or desire, but overpowers it, or at least excludes it from being considered in making a choice. In a word, law itself can be an object of respect, and thus a command.
Kant says that moral law is universal. It's a work of reason, not a byproduct of culture or individual psychology. He's firmly convinced that the moral law is the same for all rational beings. Its commands are blind to race, creed, or color. They're not sensitive to cultural differences, not tailored to fit any circumstance or condition. The commands of moral law are universal in both scope and address. Kant is certainly aware of the kind of concern that Hegel later expressed, which says that Kant's moral law is too general, that it lacks specific directions for how we should act in our own time and place. He seeks to describe in detail the universal commands of moral law. This effort leads to one of the most famous elements in Kant's moral teaching. It's called the categorical imperative. In order to understand this, it's worth looking briefly once more at the feeling of duty. Duties are experienced as a set of thou shalts and thou shalt nots, in the language of the King James Bible. These statements are called imperatives, meaning that they issue unconditional instructions or demands. In issuing commands or orders, we don't reason with those we speak to. We simply order them to act according to our direction. Kant believes that the moral law operates analogously. It, too, impels actions that fulfill its rules for conduct. In that sense, the moral law is composed of a large body of imperatives. However, imperatives relating to human actions are of two kinds. Kant distinguishes between them by calling one kind hypothetical and the other categorical.
All imperatives command either hypothetically or categorically. The former presents the practical necessity of a possible action as a means to achieving something else which one desires. The categorical imperative would be one which presented an action as of itself objectively necessary, without regard to any other end.
In other words, hypothetical imperatives are conditional. The force of their command presupposes some end or result that one desires. If I tell you, give me the money, you might obey because you expect me to buy the groceries. If you're willing to do the shopping yourself, you'll ignore my command. But if I make my order threatening, the situation's very different. Maybe I'm a thief demanding your money or your life. The sense of my command is still conditional, only now the unstated condition is something like, if you value your life. In all hypothetical imperatives, the imperative creates no sense of obligation unless the person who receives it wants whatever the commanded action offers him. If you want me to go to the store, if you don't want me to shoot you, then you'll feel some obligation to give me the money. If you don't want these things, my command has no imperative force. Such hypothetical imperatives never have universal force, since there's nothing that everyone always wants, not even life itself. Our own desires and wants change. The hypothetical imperatives that we're willing to obey change accordingly. The same holds for people with different interests. Those who want to lose weight will follow diets, while those who want to save money will shop at discount stores. But it makes no sense to treat either of these as universal imperatives. For many people, such imperatives have no compelling force. Categorical imperatives, by contrast, are genuinely universal and unconditional, in both form and content. They express commands addressed to all, without regard to different or changing interests and desires. Consider these biblical commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother. Thou shalt not kill. These commandments are categorical imperatives. For example, the prohibition against killing is not addressed purely to timid or well-meaning people. It speaks to all, including the hateful and the violent. But this example's too easy. Virtually everybody agrees that murder is an immoral act. The real issue is whether Kant's notion of categorical imperatives can help us identify the commands of the moral law in tough situations where most people don't easily agree. Kant believes that his notion does help us. He formulates the categorical imperative, the principle of the moral law. He's attempting to define a rational procedure for discovering the exact content of moral law. His famous maxim or rule is as follows.
There is, therefore, only one categorical imperative. It is, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law of nature.
Kant believes that each act we perform can be described as following some stated or unstated rule. If asked what we're doing, the best answer would always be to cite the rule we're following. A murderer may act according to an unstated rule that I'll kill anybody who gets in my way. If we give to charity, we may follow the rule, I help others less fortunate than I am. Kant's test for moral laws says that we should respect any rules of action that we'd want to be a universal law of nature. What does he mean by this? In essence, he's proposing that we do a kind of mental experiment. To discover what we ought to do, we should first formulate a rule that would apply to a specific course of action. Then we try to imagine this rule becoming a law of nature, a universal and inescapable law, just like the law of gravity. Kant claims that all non-moral rules will fail this test because treating them as laws of nature will result in a contradiction. So what's wrong if this imaginary law of nature produces a contradiction? Simply put, the point is this. Kant believes that contradictions can't exist. They can be thought, but they can't be brought into being. An imaginary world which contains a contradiction will always be only imaginary. It can't be made real. This matters morally because Kant takes the level-headed view that it should at least be possible to do the right thing. It should be possible for everyone to do the right thing. A morally perfect world should be possible, even if it's utterly unlikely. In a morally perfect world, moral laws would in fact be indistinguishable from the laws of nature. People would always act in accordance with them. So Kant says we should reject as a moral law any rule of conduct that can't, without contradiction, be made a universal law of nature. But there are some rules of conduct that don't result in contradiction, yet they still don't qualify as moral law. Kant explains it this way.
Some actions are such that the maxim cannot even be thought as a universal law without contradiction. In others, this internal impossibility is not found, though it is still impossible to will that the maxim should be raised to the universality of a law of nature.
Consider some examples. A prospective murderer who universalized his maxim would make himself a target for murder at the hands of others, hardly what he has in mind. A prospective liar would turn everyone into chronic liars, creating a world in which no one would believe anything anybody said. In this world, no one could lie, since lying depends on others believing your falsehoods. On the other hand, a charitable man can easily conceive of a world in which everyone gives to the needy. An official who treats people fairly can imagine a world in which everyone is fair. An honest businessman can imagine a world in which every businessman deals with others honestly. Kant explains that when we behave immorally, we're expecting special treatment.
When we observe ourselves in any transgression of a duty, we find that we do not actually will that our maxim should become a universal law. Rather, we will that the contrary of this maxim should remain a law for others, while we take the liberty of making an exception to it for ourselves, or for the sake of our inclination, and on this one occasion.
Hegel was critical of this entire line of thought.
The defect in the principle of Kant is that it is really formal. Chill duty is the final undigested lump left within the stomach. The revelation given to reason.
Hegel's point is that Kant never really gets beyond the idea of moral law, that is, the idea of a universal rational rule for human action. In his own philosophy, Hegel tries to take more account of the historical and cultural circumstances that Kant deliberately ignored. Even then, however, Hegel wants to save something important from Kant's idea that moral law is universal. Kant's formula hasn't proved as valuable to posterity as he hoped it would. Although it illuminates many things that seem to fit our notions of what is and is not moral, the formula is ambiguous. A major problem, which even Kant acknowledged in some of his late essays, is that it's very difficult to formulate any maxim with precision, because it's difficult to describe any human action exactly. Without an exact description, we can't be sure what we're doing. We may not know what rule of action we're following, if any. But if we can't accurately describe our behavior, then Kant's test can't be applied. Partly in recognition of these difficulties, Kant offers some additional formulations of the categorical imperative. The most important of these is as follows.
Act always so as to treat humanity in yourself or others as an end only, and never as a means.
This formulation returns to Kant's central philosophical insight, the idea that human beings are above all free and rational people. Such creatures are, Kant says, ends in themselves.
Man, and in general every rational being, exists as an end in himself, and not merely as a means to be arbitrarily used.
As free rational beings capable of purposeful action, mankind is fundamentally unlike any other creatures we know. Kant says mankind must be special to God, or what he calls the divine will.
Man is certainly unholy enough, but humanity in each person must be holy to him. Everything in creation which he wishes to use, and over which he has power, can be used merely as a means. Only man, and with him every rational creature, is an end in itself. He is the subject of the moral law, and this condition requires that the person never be used as a means, except when he is at the same time an end. We may even impose this condition on the divine will with respect to the rational beings which are its creatures.
This idea of human beings as ends in themselves goes back to Kant's belief that rational beings are free and purposeful. To treat people as means to other ends is to deny their humanity, to reduce them to things. All such actions are essentially false, for they're possible only if we have a false notion of what human beings are. Kant's moral ideal is best expressed in the idea of humanity as an end in itself. With this principle, Kant strengthens and deepens the philosophical foundation for the modern idea of human rights. He also reveals the full implications of a strong emphasis on reason, which was so common during the Enlightenment. If we take our own rational nature seriously in a practical way, we're driven first to recognize that we're responsible beings who live by the choices we make. Second, our regard for the rational nature of others compels us to respect them, their purposes, their choices, their right to pursue those purposes, to make those choices according to their own best lights. In this spirit, we simply can't remain callous and indifferent to the rights of others or treat them as mere extensions of our own selfish ends. In the end, Kant's philosophy of reason teaches us the virtues of self-respect and responsibility. Through an intricate process of self-examination, Kant lays bare many of the deepest powers that have so long been dormant within us. His philosophy challenges us to awaken these powers, to use them responsibly. With self-respect, a sense of responsibility, and a steady habit of self-examination, Kant believes we may end the long childhood of humanity. We can escape from fear and ignorance and build our lives secure in the knowledge that we have finally only our own weaknesses to fear. Human beings are not gods, but they don't need to be gods in order to be free. It's enough if we realize the potential of our rational natures. It's enough if we learn to think and act with clarity and deliberate reasoned purpose. In this way, each of us can find the degree of fulfillment and happiness appropriate to our own nature. Kant emphasizes that clear thinking and purposeful action can help us find true satisfaction in our philosophical quest for wisdom. After 2,000 years of philosophical inquiry, Kant believes he has found the key to human fulfillment. Kant spoke for this spirit of responsible independence when he described the things that inspired his deepest feelings.
Two things alone fill me with awe: the starry heavens above and the moral law within.
For Kant, the starry heavens above symbolize the search for knowledge. The moral law within symbolizes our self-respect and our respect for others. These two, Kant teaches, are the only things worthy of our deepest regard. This is the creed of enlightenment, the faith rooted in the ideals of reason itself.
This concludes Knowledge Products, The Giants of Philosophy, Immanuel Kant, narrated by Charlton Heston.